collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, a welcome boost to the island's endangered population of Griffon vultures as birds are flown in from Spain to increase numbers.
They will then start to pair up with their Cypriot cousins. Very few of them, there's only 20 remaining, and eventually increase the breeding population and increase the island population of Griffon vultures.
And we talk to a professor of Native American literature about Thanksgiving and indeed about the various issues still faced today by Native Americans.
The native people, ever since the first Europeans set foot on the soil, needed to be moved along and eventually hopefully eradicated.
Last week, 2 batches of vultures arrived from Spain by air. It's all part of the Living with Vultures programme, and the director of the Vulture Conservation Foundation joins us on this week's programme. He is Dr. Jose Tavares. Jose, can you tell us first of all about the work of the Vulture Conservation Foundation? They're lovely birds, but they don't have a very good press very often, do they?
No. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, indeed, most people think that vultures are ugly. However, they provide an absolutely essential service to our nature, to our ecosystem, because they are nature's cleanup crew. They are scavengers, so that means that they eat dead meat, and they clean our countryside from carcasses of dead animals that die naturally or by accident, and therefore provide this incredibly important ecosystem service. Without vultures, carcasses would accumulate, we would have problems of transmission of diseases, notably in cattle, and therefore they are extremely important.
And you've worked with the foundation, but I think I'm right in saying that Spain has probably Europe's largest population of vultures, and yet here in Cyprus we have a terrible job trying to prevent the ones we do have, and there aren't many, I think, left, from being poisoned.
Indeed. So the Vulture Conservation Foundation is Europe's leading conservation organization working with vultures. We are a truly international organization working across Europe. Vultures in Europe are fortunately doing relatively well, and this is of course because of conservation investment by NGOs, government, and society that has been really trying to protect and conserve these birds. In other parts of the globe, notably in Africa and in Asia, vulture populations are declining very fast. Now, in Europe, vultures occur across the Mediterranean, and as you said, Spain today holds about 90% of European vultures, and that is partly because the Spanish government and Spanish conservation organizations have invested a lot of attention, effort and money on these populations. There is plenty of food available for them. They are strictly protected. Threats have been mitigated. And what we've been doing is we've been trying to replicate this very good success story in other countries, notably in Cyprus, where indeed vultures have not been doing very well. There is now only one species of vulture left on the island, the Griffon vulture, and a tiny little small population of about 20 individuals, only 2 to 3 breeding pairs, which is in dire risk of extinction. Together with a number of Cypriot partners, including government agencies, the Game Fund, but also BirdLife Cyprus and Terra Cypriot, 2 Cypriot conservation organizations, we are trying to mitigate the threats that have been killing these vultures historically on the island. What we are also doing is we are restocking the population with these vultures that come from Spain. And and that's exactly, this is the first batch of birds arriving now in Cyprus that will be released in a few months' time into Cyprus nature after a stay of a few months in an acclimatization aviary that we've established in the hills of Western Cyprus.
Are the vultures that are coming from Spain exactly the same species as the ones that we already have in Cyprus?
They are exactly the same species. In fact, Griffon vultures are partly migratory species, and in continental Europe they travel relatively large distances. We've had Griffon vultures going from the Balkans to Spain and vice versa, coming from Spain and being seen, for example, in Croatia. So they are exactly the same species. These are birds that have not been caught in the wild. We never remove specimens from the wild. These birds come from wildlife rehabilitation centers in Spain. We do have got a protocol and an agreement with a number of Spanish regional governments. In this case, these birds came from the Extremadura region of Spain, under a protocol that we have with the Extremadura regional government that gave these birds to us. So these are birds that are picked up usually exhausted or hungry in a number of sites in Spain. They are usually young birds with not a lot of experience that fly into areas with relatively little food and then get weak and are picked up by members of the public, sent to wildlife rehabilitation hospitals in Extremadura, rehabilitated, and then normally these would be re-released or released back to the wild in Spain, but under this agreement with the Spanish government, we can now bring them to Cyprus to restock the very small island population that is struggling here. At the same time, and this is very important, we have been working on the threats that have caused a decrease of vultures in Cyprus, trying to mitigate and decrease them, because it's no good to release birds if they are going to die immediately afterwards. So we've been working on poisoning. Poisoning is the number one threat to vultures, and this is an illegal activity that is mostly done by livestock breeders or hunters, not against the vultures themselves, but against carnivores. And in the case of Cyprus, this usually means foxes or feral dogs that have got an impact on either the game species that the hunters hunt or the sheep and the goats that livestock breeders breed. And in order to try to solve this human-wildlife conflict, they resort to poison baits that are unfortunately also killing vultures. They are actually extremely dangerous to people as well. If people manipulate and then eventually ingest this poison, they can get killed, and there's been cases of people killed with illegal poison baits in other countries in Europe. So we've been mitigating this, working with the police force. We are establishing anti-poison dog units with dogs that can smell and detect these poison baits, in order to try to properly investigate and eventually prosecute judicially the perpetrators of this illegal activity. We've also been working with electricity company here in Cyprus to mitigate the threat of electrocution and collision, which is another important threat affecting vultures and other raptors and storks and cranes. Birds often collide against the electricity lines or get electrocuted when they perch on medium tension electricity pylons. There are solutions to avoid that through the installation of markers or the isolation of some cables to avoid electrocution, and we have been identifying priority areas and engaging with the electricity company to again decrease the risk of electrocution. We hope that when the birds are eventually released next spring, when we open the doors of the aviary where they will be acclimatizing to their new home in the hills of Western Cyprus, they will have a good chance of survival, so that they will then start to pair up with their Cypriot cousins. Very few of them, there's only 20 remaining, and eventually increase the breeding population and increase the island population of Griffon Vulture.
When you've got birds, as you said, that have been either hand-reared or even come close to death and been rehabilitated but are familiar with man, as it were, how easy is it? I know they do spend some time, as you said, acclimatising when they get here, and they're kept safe and fed and so on before they're released. But how quickly do they, if you like, pick up through instinct things like courting, mating and feeding themselves?
So the birds that we are bringing are not hand-reared, and indeed hand-reared birds are not suitable for introduction, because hand-reared birds are imprinted on humans, and they see humans, they are familiarized with humans, and they don't see any threat on humans. And this means that if they are released, these hand-reared birds, they will probably fly. They're attracted by humans, and they will probably fly to humans, and therefore this is no good. These birds that we are bringing are wild birds. Birds that hatched in the wild. They are picked up, injured, or most often weakened in Spain, and they go to a wildlife rehabilitation hospital. Now, in these wildlife rehabilitation hospitals, contact with humans is very limited. These are not zoos. These are facilities where contact is kept to a minimum, only to put some food and eventually for some veterinary treatment. And when they arrive in Cyprus, they will be put in this aviary, again in the hills, far away from people, where, again, a strict protocol limiting human contact is applied. They will be in touch with their Cypriot cousins because they are flying around, and there is a supplementary feeding site, what sometimes is called a vulture restaurant nearby, so they will see the wild vultures coming down and feeding on carcasses that are put there for them, and therefore they really have got very limited contact. And when they are released, they are wild birds, and they will continue their normal behavior and hopefully integrate well with the group of Cypriot birds that is living locally. So they do not really show any behavioral problems. If they did show any behavioral problems, we would not bring them for this restocking operation.
Well, at least they don't have to learn Greek. That's the Life with Vultures programme, and some 25 vultures being brought to Cyprus, hoping to boost the local population here, which is seriously endangered. Our thanks to the director of the Vulture Conservation Foundation, Dr. Jose Tavares, for joining us.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
In other news this week, Nicosia residents are up in arms with a change to what's going to happen to the central artery of Makarios Avenue. It's been closed for months due to building works, and the plan had originally been to make it a pedestrianised area with access only to buses, a move to try and encourage Cypriots onto public transport. Well, that could be about to change, because the Nicosia Integrated Mobility Plan, which was supposedly being followed by the Nicosia municipality, is perhaps going to be shelved. The Cyprus Scientific and Technical Chamber, ETTEC, came out swinging earlier this week, saying that Makarios Avenue should not be accessible to private cars. It's due to be reopened on December the 7th. The municipal council appears to have succumbed to people who are saying that residents and businesses should have access to the street. But then there's the problem of how do you check who does have access and who doesn't. If private cars are allowed there, it will prevent bus lanes from flowing in both directions, so that will significantly reduce the effectiveness and viability of public transport in the area, because unless bus lanes flow in both directions, then key networks in the city centre will be lost. ETTEC went on to say it's worth noting that in many European countries the renovation of city centres is done on the basis of reducing access to private vehicles to promote active movement, in particular walking, cycling and the use of public transport. The Audit Service waded in to the discussion in the middle of the week, saying it's possible that money would have to be returned because funding had been received for the redevelopment project. A spokesman for the Audit Service said that the project funds were allocated under specific conditions and that a change in the plans would violate the agreement. Should the municipality go ahead with the change of plans and allow the transit of private vehicles on Makarios Avenue, they said the government will have to withdraw the funds and allocate them to other projects.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
Well, as Americans on the island will know, and hopefully quite a few Cypriots too, yesterday was the holiday of Thanksgiving. And it's a great pleasure to welcome to this week's programme Dr. Steve Sexton of the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, because he gave a talk earlier this week hosted by the American Embassy in Nicosia, and it was all about, well, it started out at least as being all about Thanksgiving. So Steve, thanks for joining us. And just tell us, if you will, the story of Thanksgiving, because I think what we're taught these days is perhaps not what you as Native Americans actually interpret Thanksgiving as being.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the presentation, I do kind of talk a little bit about some of the sort of the more mythical elements, or just sort of like the romanticized story that most American kids are taught in school, as I was. And because it's been probably, the last 50 years or so, when we've seen a lot of Americans basically kind of looking at that story. And I imagine it happened long before that. So some of the elements, there's contradictions here and there. Some people are debating whether or not it happened in 1621 and happened in 1637. Some people attribute the first Thanksgiving to be a celebration of a massacre of the Pequots in 1637. But the dinner itself, 1621, the one that happened then, it obviously is kind of portrayed as this, this feast that they invited the local natives to and they celebrated. But there are conflicting accounts that it really wasn't so much like a celebration, at least in part of in terms of celebrating with the Native Americans. They were celebrating the harvest, and some accounts say they invited them over. Some accounts say they showed up because the colonists were getting a little wild, a little rambunctious, so they showed up with their lawyers to make sure they would stay in line. And there's even a letter that states that they didn't view the natives, Wampanoags, as equals, so they didn't invite them to their feasts. So there are conflicting reports of it, but of course the story is, the Pilgrims came over looking for religious freedom, and the natives helped them out. And as a celebration in the fall, because of the great harvest, they had this 3-day feast, and it was all love and friendship. So that's the story I was told as a child.
Of course, the all love and friendship didn't last very long, did it? Particularly in certain areas. So can we talk a little bit, first of all, about how things developed? But I'm also interested, since you are a specialist in Native American literature, to talk about how the stories and the way that those stories are passed on among indigenous peoples who've been colonised, because that's exactly what it was, of course. How do you keep those alive, and does literature serve a purpose in doing that?
Well, yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, it does. A part of the presentation I gave talks about stories, starting with the Thanksgiving story, but it kind of further talks about the role that stories have in our lives, how they tend to create the way we think and the way we view the world. And I kind of present the Thanksgiving story as a national story, a national U.S. creation story, if you want to even put it that way. And for me personally, my father was in the Army growing up. So I grew up grew up partly in Europe and partly in the United States. So I know in my own household, Thanksgiving was more or less observed like it usually is. We watched the Macy's Day Thanksgiving parade in the morning, and then my parents, my mother, or whoever came over would enjoy our Thanksgiving. And in my household, at least, we did scrutinize it. I didn't want to say that we weren't aware enough to do it, but like I said, it wasn't at least in my own personal household, it was something that wasn't as scrutinized as it is today. But that's not to say that indigenous people have been protesting this holiday. As a matter of fact, in the presentation I gave, I mentioned an annual protest that's been happening since 1970. They call it the National Day of Mourning. So that is sort of, in terms of the literature, though, you'll see it referenced every now and then throughout it. But what's interesting about Native American literature and trying to match up, what's going on with our scrutiny of such stories like Thanksgiving, or even a larger sense, like looking at certain policies like the Allotment Act or the Relocation Act in the 1950s, a lot of indigenous storytellers don't treat that as a subject in and of itself, but rather they focus on the Native people and how they've been affected by such policies. So when it comes to Thanksgiving, when it comes to this national creation story, this U.S. creation story, Native people are familiar with it, people who grew up with it, and they've been scrutinizing it because, yeah, as you say, we started off friendly, but then again, you have to ask yourself, what happened? And the story continues from there. We essentially disappeared. The Native people, ever since the first Europeans set foot on the soil, needed to be moved along, and eventually hopefully eradicated.
And they haven't been, but they are at a great disadvantage in many areas, aren't they? I'm thinking of postcodes when you want to get a voting book. I'm thinking of the very well publicised stories of the fight for rights on burial lands, pipelines going through Native American lands, and of course the water question that was very much on social media a couple of years ago. It's disappeared off there now. I'm not sure what the situation is, but it's quite clear that Native Americans are not treated equally with many other citizens of the USA. So how do you deal with that? And indeed, how does the tribalism, because there are so many different tribes of Native Americans, do you work together? Have you overcome those historic differences to fight together for your rights?
I suppose, the answer is both yes and no. I mean, I guess it depends. It depends on what it is you're talking about, what era and what particular context you're talking about. During the 60s and 70s, when you had the Red Power movement happen, you had this strong sense of pan-Indianism, which a lot of scholars and a lot of people have kind of replaced with the idea of intertribalism. So you did have, the Red Power movement coinciding with this, and of course the Day of National Mourning that I just mentioned, it's no coincidence that started in 1970, at the height of the Red Power movement. So you sort of see this correlation between what's going on nationally, what's going on in Indian country, because at the same time during the 70s you also have this rise, this prolific outpour in Native American literature and art that some scholars call the Native American Renaissance, And when you refer to, the Standing Rock protest a few years ago, and then the movement, especially coming out of Canada, the Idle No More movement, really saw this resurgence of Indigenous activism, both in the United States and Canada. And again, just like the Native American Renaissance of the late 60s, early 70s, and into the 80s, we're seeing another outpour of literature and art, and even more so because of technology. Now we have a lot of filmmakers, video games, for example, Indigenous video games, comic books. So I think what we're seeing here is sort of like a correlation of Indigenous people. When we ramp up the activism, it gets people writing, it gets people thinking of art, it gets people thinking, thinking creatively and wanting to write novels, poetry, paintings, make video games, make videos, make films. So I do think we're seeing an outpour of that right now. And I tell my students all the time, I have a problem. It's a good problem to have, and that is my field is currently producing a lot of literature that I am having trouble keeping up with it. On top of all of my other duties as a professor, I'm having to try to keep up with my field. But it's a good problem, and I'm really happy to have it.
And how far do you think that this art, literature, creativeness actually helps to get a message across to people who possibly are not aware of some of the issues, but rather than going out and demonstrating or standing up at Standing Rock?
So one of the things that the Red Power movement did in the 60s and 70s, and one of the things that the Standing Rock did was actually kind of bring this to the national attention, whereas a lot of times it's not known. When I was at the University of Oklahoma getting my doctorate, I taught my first Native American Lit class. And as I was preparing for it, I had asked one of my mentors, what can I expect my students to know about Native Americans? I was thinking that we lived in Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, there are 35 tribal nations. If you grew up in Oklahoma, you weren't likely, either grew up around other natives or you knew a few in your lifetime. So I figured these people, these students at OU, my home, knew a lot more about Native people. And my mentor just shook her head and said they're not going to know anything. You can't anticipate that. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges. I don't want to say challenges, but one of the things that I do have to overcome, and when I prepare my lesson plans, when I'm teaching. And I think that because of that, I feel very fortunate that I have that audience that comes to these stories, Indigenous people portraying themselves and sort of asserting who they are into a world that has basically decided who we are, and it looks nothing like us. That's the first thing I ask my students is like, what do you think of when we think of a Native American? And we talk about that, and I tell them, like, a lot of what you think of Native Americans are oftentimes inaccurate and oftentimes racist. But we also get those from popular culture. We get those from school, television shows, movies, the way we've been portrayed. And so there is a great discrepancy between how the imagined Indian, and I'll put quote marks around Indian because I'm using that in a facetious way, the imagined Indian as the population imagines us and how we really are pretty far away from each other. And what's even worse is how we're portrayed or how we're imagined is a lot more ubiquitous and overwhelming than what we're trying to project ourselves out to be. That's kind of what I tend to focus a little bit about on, at least when I'm dealing with my students who know very little about Native Americans. In my evaluations, I learned a lot about Native American culture. And I'm as much as happy as I am with that, I'm like, okay, but I also want you to learn a little bit more about the literature. I want you to learn a little bit about these stories that we're telling and how we're telling them and why they're important, why these stories, why they make a difference. Because I tell my students all the time, if you know somebody's story, it's a lot harder to just dismiss them. And so that's what I try to do in my class.
And the way that art is consumed these days, I suppose there must be an upswing in Native American cinema as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, this semester I'm teaching a course on film adaptations in Native American literature. Now, granted, there haven't been a whole lot. There's actually only been 5 stories that we've been focused on all semester. But Indigenous film, cinema is really blowing up as well in the last 15, 20 years. And we're seeing some wonderful art being produced.
And we're looking forward to more. I know I have to let you go. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Can I just ask you finally whether the bottom line of everything we've been talking about is the fact that correct history is perhaps not taught from the earliest ages in American schools?
I would totally agree with that. As the old adage goes, the history is written by the winners. And the correct story, actually, I would imagine there are more than one correct story. There are multiple stories to just the story of Thanksgiving, for that matter. And focusing on one single story, of course, I think there's a lot of scholarship, a lot of research for that. So, absolutely, yeah.
It will get out there eventually, I'm sure, and be absorbed by a lot of people with great interest.
We're doing our best.
Dr. Steve Sexton of the University of Nevada, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.